Hello and welcome to another Focus Finder. Now, as this starting slide says, it's a capital mistake to theorise before one has data. Now, that's actually a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or more particularly Sherlock Holmes, as we should know it. And I think it's particularly true for the design of buildings as well, because what we often find is that there's a lot of theorising, there's a lot of creativity, but there's very little data to support assumptions and designs that you find laid in front of you. So what I utilise is an evidence-based approach to my design, and I'm going to be running through today some examples of why an evidence-based approach is important and how it can be made to work, and some areas that you might want to think about when you're looking for this kind of design process. So a number of years ago, when Dr. Jez Wingfield was working at Leeds Metropolitan University, he said to me, until we can get the processes right and have robust ways of checking and verifying performance, then the targets themselves become secondary. Now, this is really key, because what you find is, in the UK at least, we've got a plethora, a whole multitude of different energy standards and the likes, all of which clamour for playing games, whether it's zero or the lowest this, the lowest that, the first this, the first that. What you find is that buildings don't perform, and this is coming from the studies that have been undertaken by Leeds Met and others. So really, I mean, what Leeds Met have found is they established that there was party wall bypass. Now this is a phenomenon where the warm air rises, surprisingly or not, and it's hadn't been accounted for in the UK building regulations. That issue has now been addressed by the regulations, but if you go down onto a building site, you may still struggle to see it actually being addressed on site, because again, there's the regulations, the theory of the regulations, and then it's how it's been applied both in the design process and the construction process. So how do buildings really perform in reality is the key question. And then when you start to think about it in more detail, it's the fact that you can't manage what you can't measure. And this is one of the difficulties that we face with buildings. We don't do an awful lot of post-occupancy evaluation, a lot of building performance evaluation, ways of trying to look and see whether the building did what we expected it to do in the first place. So you've got to be very cautious when people start talking about using passive house principles and other sort of flaky terms, because it might be that they aren't actually appreciating some of the quality assurance issues that can underpin passive house. And it might, there's other elements whereby I've poked around at passive house and inquired about certain things and challenged it, and even though some of the things that I have identified are complementary to thoughts on passive house, they aren't actually addressed by passive house, and therefore you've got areas whereby there are certain risks that need to be addressed in order to deliver building performance, and we'll be coming on to some of those things in a moment. So this is an extract from Leeds Met. And what you can see here is they were looking at carbon emissions from properties, and that's the numbers up on the graph on the left hand side, and the zero line represents the building regulations and the requirements that were held at the time, and in terms of energy use. And there you've got, along the bottom, you've got Part L 1995, Approved Document L 2002, and approved document L is the building regulations, energy management kind of side of things, energy efficiency in buildings measures. So therefore what you've got is moving through successive years of different building regulations. You've got the Code for Sustainable Homes, which has been around for a while, and then you've got Stamford Brook, which was a project that Leeds Metropolitan University were involved with, and they were seeking to improve the energy efficiency of buildings in such a way that they were preparing for what they were thinking was going to be the building regulations of 2010. And then you've got successive other aspects of the Code for Sustainable Homes, going through codes 1 through to 4, 5 and 6, and then we've got, in this case, we've got an example detail in there as well. So that's the bottom of the graph. What we've got then is this blue kind of line with the dots on it. Now that's how the buildings have been designed to perform. And then what you have in the little red square is how they actually performed. And what you see is that the gap between the theoretical performance and the delivered performance is quite substantial. So therefore you've got buildings that are being designed to achieve, well, shall we say in this case, well, the example detailed, yeah, that has been designed to achieve at one standard, the blue dot. It's been measured to actually perform differently, which is the red dot, and it's actually performing as badly as something that was meant to be code 3 when it should have been achieving a much higher standard performance than that. Similarly at Stamford Brook, the properties were designed to achieve a low energy, a low carbon emission standard of around about 20 kilograms of carbon per metre square. And what you find is that it's actually performing like the 2006 building regulations rather than 2010. And this is because of a catalogue of design issues and design failures and construction failures. So it's an institutional problem across the whole of the industry. It's not one particular party's fault, shall we say. And here we've got a similar sort. That was looking at residential design. We've got a similar story here with schools in this case. And what you can see is, I know there's a bewildering array of colours on there, and perhaps you want to come back and pause this slide and have a closer look. But really what I'm going to focus on is the fact that we've got the passive house schools here in this red box that's just appeared, and these are outperforming the other UK schools. And the design standard of passive houses outperforming other UK schools that have been built in recent years. And then you've got the Reedbeg Passive House School, which is performing even better, shall we say, or within, more precisely to say, within the passive house standard. So therefore it's got very low space heating demand and very low energy demand for any electricity and gas and the likes. And in fact it's slightly, in terms of carbon emissions, the picture's slightly better because there's some assumptions here that the building's been heated with natural gas. So this is kind of a worst case scenario if you buy into the zero numbers game with biomass, which I personally do question. So what we've got here is we've got the building schools for the future, operational target of 27 kilograms per metre square of carbon emissions, and you can see that the only property or the only design standard that's actually achieving that is the passive house standard, and in practice only the Reedbeg School is achieving this in practice. So it really kind of points towards the fact that we've got some major issues in the UK construction industry, both for residential design and for schools design. And then you have to bear in mind the fact that by 2018 the UK operational target has been set as 0 for non-domestic buildings, public buildings, and you've got to question whether we're going to be able to achieve that using current design methodologies. So what we've got here is another graph, I'm afraid. What we're looking at is the predicted performance in blue and the measured performance in red. And what this means is you can see that you have properties whereby the blue line is particularly short, and yet the red line is that much greater, in some cases between 30 and 50% greater. And then over on the right hand side you see some passive house projects that I've been involved with whereby we've used very high standards of quality assurance, and these measurements and the predicted performance are coming out within measurement error. So even though there's a slight anomaly there, the fact that we've reduced the energy use so significantly brings it to within measurement area of the measurement technique that we were using, which was known as co-heating tests. And again, these studies have been done by Leeds Metropolitan University. So you can close the performance gap. It's not that it can't be addressed, but you've got to have specific understandings of quality, the right kinds of quality assurance methods, of which passive houses can be a part of that. And then there have been a series of other studies done, looking at co-heating tests, and you've got the racecourse passive house units, which we just looked at, and those are the ones that I was involved with. And there's also the Larch House, Limehouse by Beer Architects, and also Ranulph Road, which was another Beer Architects project. And the slight anomaly with that one is the fact that it's coming out negative, and that's because of some solar gains, it's used to throw the whole calculations out. And then, yeah, so there's a growing number of studies which are showing that buildings can perform as required when designed appropriately. So I found myself wondering whether Passive House actually performs appropriately, and that led me to going away and unearthing a whole series of properties that had been constructed. 228 examples in total, and what I looked for was to try and identify what the average energy use was, and I determined that that was around about 17 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, which is outside of the 15 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, which is the target. So it was 2 out, which is an error, and the question that I had was, is that error too large? Well, when I spoke to Wolfgang Feiss, from the founder of the Passive House Institute, he actually clarified to me that in the first year you can expect around about 1.5 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum worth of additional energy to help dry the building out, because a building that's been constructed on a building site, it's been exposed to the elements, and therefore there's that much more kind of moisture latent within the building itself. So as that dries out, you get an elevated energy consumption. So if you adjust for that, then you've got the situation whereby the mean, this adjusted mean value is around about 15.5 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, which is about right. It's about, give or take, near as damn. It's pretty much backs up this idea that passive house buildings can work in some respects. Okay, so and just to set this in greater context, we've got our old buildings on the left, and we've got our low energy buildings in the middle, and we've got passive house buildings on the right. And there's several important observations to make from these series of graphs on this page. The first is the fact that the averages drop, from 180 down to around about 70, shall we say, and then down to around about 15 kilowatt hours per metre square for the passive houses. So on average, these significant savings are held, but on an individual basis, they're wrong. On an individual basis, there's deviations, and it's a really important thing to recognise that your individual home will be part of that range of statistics. So the more houses that we have measured, the greater certainty we can have about whether the building's performing as we'd have expected. Now, if we look a little bit more closely, say at the old buildings, what you see is you've got one property consuming very little energy in relative sense, kind of around about 75 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, for instance. And meanwhile, over on the right hand side of that old buildings category, number 61, you've got somebody using in excess of 400 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum. So there's a huge difference. So that's the equivalent of, well, the high energy user being somebody that's walking around in their t-shirt and shorts with their window open, versus somebody that has got no heating on, that's wrapped up in a scarf and a woolly hat and their gloves, and is using the least amount of energy as possible. So, and then we've got the S-curve, as I describe it, which shows that a whole host of different people doing their own things in their own houses. Now, as we move from the old building towards the low energy building, you see that S-curve shallow off. Now that's really important, because what it shows you is that we actually have a limited amount of impact upon our building. Because basically what's important is the average temperature in the building over the whole of the heating season. So, and that's, as I said, being an average, those individual times when we're in the building has not too much of an impact. So if you're opening the windows or doing different things just to on a daily basis just to help feel comfortable, you're not necessarily going to be having a huge impact if you're not going to be doing those things for too long. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why the passive house buildings have got that very, very shallow, almost flat kind of S-curve for the range of properties that have been studied in that case, which goes back to my other study and backs it all up and supports everything whereby passive houses would appear to work. So what we can get is a 90% reduction in energy use through ensuring that the quality assurance methods and the actual energy performance target, so that's two things, quality assurance methods and the energy performance target, are both pulled together in the right kind of way. But of course, it's not always just about energy in terms of ensuring that we get building performance in the right kind of way. Because if you're putting mechanical heat recovery systems into buildings, then you've got to think very carefully about the acoustics. So here on the right we've got Jack Harvey-Clark from Apex Acoustics up here in the northeast, and he did some acoustic tests at Racecourse. And he found that the noise levels in those properties were such that, well, more or less speaking, that the noise from the fridge was louder than the noise from the ventilation system, which is exactly what you want. Jack and I co-authored a paper on ventilation and noise, and one of the things that we established after having reviewed over 1,000 homes throughout Europe and the world was that the noise from an MVHR system, or any mechanical ventilation system I should say, can be such that it will lead people to turn the ventilation system off or down if they feel that there's too much noise, and that can have a negative impact upon your indoor air quality. Similarly, of course, you've got issues with window utilisation in the winter, that people tend to close the windows and keep all of the trickle vents shut, and therefore what happens, because they're trying to avoid cold drafts, of course, and what happens is the indoor air quality can be compromised as well. So there are different ways that indoor air quality can be compromised, and you've got to think about developing a robust solution which will enable you to minimise the amount of energy that's used, and whilst not compromising health and well-being, comfort and those kinds of things as well. So there's a whole balance to be struck. But one of the other things to think about when you are installing mechanical systems is to make sure that the ductwork is very clean. And I've unearthed a Finnish standard which actually establishes a cleanliness standard for ductwork. The Passive House standard itself requires that ductwork is clean, but it doesn't specify how clean is clean enough. So that can create all sorts of challenges and issues on a building site with a building contractor, for understandable and fair reasons. So the thing to do is to have a quality assurance standard which will enable you to specify how clean the ductwork should be. Now over here on the right we've got an example of good practice, and over on the left we've got an example of what we really don't want to be able to see on site. So what we've got on the right are capped ductwork as it's been stored on site and then as it's been installed, whereas on the left you can see how the ductwork isn't being protected, it's getting dirt and debris in there on the building site, whether it's from the location where it's been stored or once it's been installed. So you've got to pay some very careful attention. You've got to make sure you've got the right quality assurance standards in the building specifications at tender stage, and also on the building site, in order to help ensure that buildings are going to be delivered in a way that performs as indeed they should. And then you've also got to make sure that the mechanical ventilation systems are commissioned in the appropriate way. And this is within building regulations, it's stipulated that they should, but again it's found that often this isn't the case. So you've got to make sure that you've got the right kind of quality assurance methods in place to make sure that the commissioning takes place in the appropriate way, and the appropriate people are employed to be able to complete those tasks. And again, this is something that I've looked into quite heavily, and I've got a great degree of confidence in the approach that I've got, because again there are measurements and statistics that back all of this up. But of course it's not all about those kind of empirical measurements and things. We've got people that live in buildings. It's just that in buildings, the best people, in buildings people are the best measuring instruments. They're just hard to calibrate. And this is a quote from Gary Raw when he was UK director of the Centre for Safety, Health and Environment. And so what we've got here is we've got a situation whereby how do we get feedback from people and what their comfort is? Well, as it happens, there is a questionnaire system that's been developed by a chap called Adrian Lehman, a sociologist, and basically this can be utilised, this building use studies survey can be utilised to evaluate the performance of buildings as perceived by the occupants of those buildings. And one study was undertaken at Racecourse, which was a project that I worked on. And what we've got here is some more graphs from that particular study. And what you find is along the centre line on the 0 axis, we've got a percentile of satisfaction, and then we've got on the left hand side of the graph you've got +3 down to -3, and that's the degree of satisfaction that's coming through there. So what you find here is that the little grey circles, they're other properties, or other developments I should say, that have also had this same bus survey undertaken. And you can see the black dot, and the black dot's racecourse. So it's actually kind of the comfort index study is showing that racecourse has got very superior levels of comfort compared to some of these other properties. And if we go through to the satisfaction index, then you start to see the same kind of story being told. So we're getting some very positive feedback from the occupants here. Now, it wasn't everybody that's responded. I think it was 19 out of 25 from memory. And overall, the comfort remains in this kind of exemplary position, whereby on the top hand right, racecourse is positioned in a much more favourable place, very high levels of satisfaction compared to some of the other properties that have, other developments that have been studied. So the feedback from people, and we've skipped the names here just to to maintain their own privacy. But basically, what you've got, this is feedback from the tenants, as reported by Leeds Metropolitan University. The feedback was such that these bungalows are beautiful. We haven't had our heating on yet. My husband was always cold before we came here. It's amazing. We were just saying this morning how fortunate we are to be given the chance to live in one of these properties. Another quote: "Passive bungalows are fantastic. I absolutely love my home, and I've settled in here well. It's great to have. It's great in the cold weather. My new home is cosy and warm, and I don't have to worry about the heating costs anymore, as I rarely use it. I really like living here in the bungalows. Are brilliant." So some really great feedback there from the tenants. So when we start to think about the design and how we deliver it, we've got to think carefully about what we're going to do. So what we've got here being mapped out is the RIBA plan of work over a period of time. Now, the RIBA plan of work is standard within the construction industry, and everybody knows what it is. And we go through from the strategic definition phase through to preparation and brief, concept, detailed, develop design, technical design, through to construction, then through to handover and close out, and then the in-use stage. And if we start to think about this, not only this time scale, but the amount of energy that effort that goes in, then what we find is, well, we've got a number of milestones that we have to that we bump into, should we say, along the way. We've got the needs and options review. We've got going for planning permission, and going for building regulations, employing with a building contractor, practical completion, so when your building's been finished, and then also completion itself. And over time, you've not only got time, we've got the amount of effort that we introduce to a project, and that changes as a project progresses. And if we look at it from an architectural perspective, then what you find is that with traditional design, that we start off with a relatively low amount of effort, and then that increases over time to once we get to the technical design stage, and then it begins to fall away again towards handover and closeout. Now, if we then start to think about this in the context of opportunity to introduce change to your project, so because let's face it, sooner or later you're going to want to move a window or change a door, and it might not necessarily be you, it could even be third parties that are having an influence over the design, such as the planning authority or something like that. So therefore, this is this graph is now, the blue line is showing how there's a limited opportunity to influence the design, and you can see that the largest proportional chance for you to influence the design is at that, at those very formative stages, at strategic brief, preparation, strategic definition, preparation and brief, in that kind of area, and then just as you begin to get into the concept design, but then it very quickly falls away. So you've got to really start to think very carefully about the design process, and when you've got such a large amount of effort that's been taking place in the technical design stage, it's a bit disbalanced. The two are not congruent with one another. And the cost of change increases over time as well, because not only have you got more and more documents and design work that's been undertaken, and therefore if you make one small change you might have to change multiple drawings and schedules and specifications, etc. But once you're on a building site, then the cost is even greater if you're trying to move that window. Forming a new opening is particularly expensive. So really, traditionally what we've done is we've sought to try and get the design resolved by the end of the technical design phase, and that because by that point we're flushing out all the details and we're starting to understand where the real costs are and where the risks are and things like that. But the problem with this is that it's just before you start on site. So therefore, and the design's fixed pretty much because we've got planning permission, we've got building regulations. There's very little scope for making further changes. So what ends up happening is you end up stripping back all the finishes and compromising the end result, which is far from ideal. So if we then start to think about things afresh, then if we take Abraham Lincoln, his quote: "If I had 9 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend the first 6 sharpening my axe." So preparation is key. Preparation is absolutely fundamental. So when you start to think about traditional design, and then you don't want to be making changes here. Oh, this is the time to make changes earlier on. Sorry, you don't want to be making changes here at this late stage, and certainly not once the building's on site. So if you've got a design and build approach whereby you do as little design as possible, then you get the building contractor to do it all, then actually the situation ends up even worse, because now all the effort is going on at an even later stage when you're on site, and those risks are even higher. So the traditional the current design and build model is questionable in many respects. So really there's got to be another way, and this is the methodology that I've started to integrate into my practice. In fact, it's very deeply embedded within my practice, I should say. And that's one whereby we utilise integrated design, and this means we work harder at the beginning, we work more closely with you, we have developed tools and techniques, the needs and options review being one example of that, to really kind of draw out some really important key factors which are going to influence the design at all later stages. So this extra effort, of course, has to be taken into account and influences the way in which we develop projects. And it's absolutely fundamental when you're trying to manage quality, manage cost, and also manage time in the most appropriate way. So therefore, we're able to think about how we might then control risk. And really, what we're talking about with controlling risk, the best way to do that is actually to think about it in terms of, well, your brief. What are you telling us to do? If we understand your brief properly, then we can actually help use that as a way of containing and managing the risk, and actually ensuring that the quality and the cost and the time kind of targets are all married up and delivered in the most appropriate way. Okay, so where we're thinking about developing buildings that will perform in practice, it's really key to make sure that we get the design right, and that we spend the right time in the right places to get the quality assurance in place to enable buildings to perform as expected. Okay, if you found this little tutorial, if this little training video has been useful, then please enter your details below and you'll get onto the newsletter, and I will keep you updated with any emerging facts, figures, useful things to know. And this isn't just for people that are seeking new buildings, new homes, new offices, etc. Well, this is also a key focus for people that are in the building construction industry, because the little nuggets that I give away are hopefully working towards helping to transform the industry and improve the quality assurance throughout the whole of the industry. That's the target of my practice. It's not only to change the individual buildings that I do, but it's also to help work and change the nature of the industry as a whole. So if you want to get on board, then please sign up and get involved with the newsletter. Okay. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.